I'm CEO of Lead Inclusion and clinical professor at San Diego State University. Today we'll be talking about healthy assessment and grading practices. This is how you can get in touch with me. And I'd like to point you to this resource on Twitter. SBL Chat is a chat that happens during the academic year on the first and third Wednesdays at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. And it's just a great place to engage and ask your questions to other educators out there around the world. This book was a follow-up to an academic paper led by Sue Brookhart. This is published by ASCD and includes much of the research that backs the practices that we'll be talking about today. What I'd like for you to do first is to think about how do you feel about a move away from traditional grading practices? Which of these emotions fits your emotion the most? Now, if you feel this way, and a lot of people do, you feel scared, you're nervous about a move away from traditional grading practices because it's all you've ever experienced your whole life and it's what you've been doing. Well, never fear. Wait, that's a creepy way to say it. Hold on. You're not alone. People all over the world are using different grading practices, healthier grading practices, to be able to understand what students know, understand and are able to do, and to be able to communicate that with others. So there have been many missteps over the years. We've learned a lot over the years about better ways to implement new grading practices, and I'll share in this video some of the pitfalls to avoid, how to do so, and how standards-based grading looks. So if your emotion is more like this one, you're bored, this is another school initiative, I understand how you could feel that way. A question I would ask though is, how important is equity to you? Because as we'll see in this video, grading and assessment practices quickly become issues of equity. So if equity is really important to you, equity in learning, equity in opportunity, then healthier assessment grading practices are important to you. Now, if you feel this way, and a lot of people do, you've heard about this, you've gone to a conference, you've spent some time reading books, you're really excited about making a move to standards-based grading. I felt the same way, but just know that you may be responsible for these people feeling the way that they do about standards-based grading or different grading practices or practices that aren't traditional. So, and in fact, it can be that feeling this way, this excitement, can lead to one of the major pitfalls that we see. Sometimes people get so excited going to a conference or reading, and they come back and there's this shift, this huge push to shift the practices right away. But shifting grading practices really isn't the first step in this, and it can lead to mutiny, if you will. There's a Facebook page, Standards-Based Learning and Grading, that you could join. It's a great place to connect with researchers, with consultants, with many educators. Thousands of educators are on this page. You do want to be careful to join this one and not this one. This one does exist. I joined it. I was kicked out within an hour or so, probably because I felt like that woman felt and was really enthusiastic about a move to non-traditional grading practices. What we know is that starting with the grading practices and being enthusiastic about changing how we grade can lead to those issues. It can lead to people having misunderstandings and just wanting to do it in the way that we all understand. We have to start with relationships and assessment before we ever get to report cards, the way that we report learning. When we think about the relationships that precede a move to non-traditional grading practices, to healthy grading practices, that means that we move to a mentor type role, which may be different than we've experienced with our own educators, or maybe you can think of teachers that you had in the past who really served in a mentor type role. When we think about words that align with mentor, what are some words that we can think about that connect, that make you think of mentor or qualities of a mentor? When I think of mentor, I think of of someone who's on my side, someone who wants me to learn, who wants me to gain skills, who has my best interest at heart, someone who's an advocate and someone who cares. Perhaps you thought of some words that were similar. Now, skydiving really is the one example I can think of where you don't get a second chance. I suppose we can think of a few others, but really, this argument of in the real world we don't get a second chance is really a fallacy. We do get second chances in the world. I mess up all the time, and I'm so grateful that I have second chances. We all do. We all mess up all the time and get second chances. And school is the real world for students at this time in their lives, and giving second chances and promoting learning is our goal. It's to prepare students by teaching them. What are some words that align with judge? Now, everybody had this guy in school. Maybe you had this guy in college, the professor who says, "No one ever earns an A in my class. You'll be lucky if you get a C. Half of you will fail." He's probably a good guy. He's probably a fine guy, but he's just confused what it means to be a good teacher. He's interpreted good teaching to mean I'm a good teacher if I'm a hard teacher. I'm a good teacher if not many kids get there, which is not quite right, is it? You're a good teacher if you can get everybody there. Really, it's a misunderstanding of the word rigor. I'm a good teacher if I'm rigorous. It's not exactly what rigorous means, but I can see if I'm rigorous if not many students get high grades. I can ensure not many students get high grades if I make assessment items or tasks tricky or difficult unnecessarily. If I choose obscure passages to see if students read. That's not really what rigor is. Rigor means cultivating a deep understanding. And it's not about making tasks tricky or difficult. It's about mentoring students until they have that deep understanding. This quickly becomes an issue of equity. Have you heard about the canaries in the coal mine? Canaries in the coal mine were a way to alert miners of danger. They were taken into the coal mine, and if the canary died, that was an indicator that there was gas, that the miners were being exposed and needed to get out. It would harm the canary before it harmed humans. And so even though grading practices that are traditional maybe didn't harm you, maybe you got by fine with traditional grading practices, maybe many of our students get by okay, that doesn't mean that it's okay. That doesn't mean it's a great practice. And traditional grading practices do indeed harm students who maybe take longer to learn, who maybe need more support to learn, who aren't on a typical path to learn as quickly as all students. So I'd like to give you an example from something my daughter experienced this past year at her first year at university. She was in a statistics class, and the instructor was awesome. She was an amazing teacher, taught the content really, really well. But when it came time to be tested, she expected students to show what they knew on a computer, and they had to memorize the statistics formula in order to carry out the statistical procedures. Well, for a lot of students, they understood the statistics, they understood how to carry out the procedures and how to interpret those, but memorizing the formula was a barrier. But that wasn't really what the teacher probably would have said was really important, what skills and understanding she wanted students to have. She probably would have said it's most important that students understand, that they understand standard deviation, that they understand distributions, that they understand hypotheses and how to test those and make decisions. But what she was really measuring is, could the students memorize the formula? For students who have difficulty with memorization of facts, not connected to something meaningful and not connected to something that's of prior knowledge or of meaning in their life, this is really difficult. It's difficult to memorize isolated facts in this way. And so for students who have that difficulty, such as students who have dyslexia and a lot of other students, this was a barrier. There are many ways that students can show what they know and understand. It doesn't have to be in the same format for everyone. This is an important part of healthy assessment, giving students options to show what they know and are able to do and what they understand. Better assessment decisions means fewer accommodations. We don't have to make as many accommodations for students when we design our assessment from the outset to better. An important part of standards-based learning and grading and having better assessments is that we focus on skills instead of on tasks. The way we used to think about this was that having the skills was a means to complete the task, the assessment, that big exam. That was the end goal. The new way of thinking about assessment is that tasks are a means to learn skills or to gain understanding, deep understanding of a concept. It's not about the assessment as the end goal. It's about gaining the skills and understanding. That's the end goal. Alfie Kahn uses some strong language to weigh in on his opinion on this. He says, teachers who listen to kids' conversations, observe their projects, and read their writing don't need to use tests. But this assumes kids have a chance to converse, design projects, and write. If they just listen to lectures and do worksheets, there's not much authentic learning to be assessed. Alfie Kahn is asserting that we don't even need some of the big high-stakes assessments that we used to think were the end goal. The end goal is the learning, and we can see evidence of learning throughout the day, all day, every day, even without our traditional assessments. When it's about the skills instead of the tasks, students can tell you ways they want to demonstrate their learning. They can give you ideas about the many ways that they'd like to show what they understand. It doesn't have to be a paper and pencil test. They can create videos. They can develop projects and presentations. They can have conversations with you individually. Many ways students can show what they understand and know. We want to give these options of multiple means for students to express what they know. By doing so, we give each student a chance to be able to show their best performance on what it is that we're trying to measure. By doing this, you may think, oh, well, that's not as fair to give one student an option to present this and another student an option to take a test. But in fact, it is the most fair way to assess because we're taking out all external influences to be able to measure exactly what it is we're trying to measure. We're not talking about lowering the expectations on the measure. We're talking about giving many options for the mode of how a student shows what they know and understand. Assessment is necessary. Being able to assess and know what students understand and are able to do is necessary. Classroom assessment and external exams have different purposes though. What is the purpose of classroom assessment? The ongoing assessment that we do on a day-to-day basis with students, both informal and formal. Really, the purpose of classroom assessment, first and foremost, is to inform our instruction. The main reason we assess students' learning is not to put a grade on a report card. It's to inform what I do with the student to improve their learning, as a mentor to get that student there. That's the primary purpose. And so all of our methods of assessment need to serve that purpose. In many schools, there's work on separating the idea of formative from summative. So we have, these are our formatives and these are our summatives. It's become a noun. So these are our formative types of assessments and these are our summative ones. But maybe there's a better way to think about this. Instead of these being the formative types and those being the summative types, let's think about it as a point in time or periods of time. Really, when we're using healthy assessment and grading practices, everything that happens all year long or the entire course long is the formative period of time. This is the time of growth. This is the time when we're giving feedback and helping students to improve their learning. This makes up almost all of what we do all year long. It's only at the end points that we use data summatively. We do report data summatively at the end of reporting periods, but then that quickly becomes formative again because those grades can and should be able to change until we get to the end of the course. And it's only at the end of the course that we have a summative point in time where our data and information are used purely summatively to report where the student is at this point in time. Up until that point, everything really should be used formatively. Feedback then is our most powerful intervention for all students in the general education classroom. Hattie's meta-analyses of many studies throughout education demonstrates the power of feedback. Grading does not have a similar power. It's our feedback that does. In fact, we know that giving a grade without feedback is actually harmful, and even giving a grade with feedback makes it less likely that students will improve. There are a number of studies, including Anna Lipnovich's dissertation and subsequent publications, that help us understand really the power of feedback versus grades in engaging and improving student learning. You may not remember the name Robert Merton, but you certainly remember the term he coined, which is self-fulfilling prophecy. Robert Merton helped us understand that when we believe something to be true, it makes it more likely that that outcome will happen. And that is true in education as well. John Hattie's studies and meta-analyses show us that when we believe something is likely to be true for a student, when we limit what we believe can happen for a student, or we believe a student can achieve really well, that makes it more likely that the student will achieve in that way. So we have to keep our expectations high. Moving to healthy grading and assessment practices is not about lowering expectations. We want to keep high expectations, but we want to see it as our job to get students there, including behaviors. If a student is having trouble being engaged, it's our job to improve their engagement. If a student is having trouble following through or doing work outside of school, it's our job to figure out how to motivate the student to stay engaged and make that accessible for a student. In the end, a standards-based report card is not the goal of healthy grading and assessment practices, but moving away from traditional assessment and grading practices is necessary if we're to have equity in our instruction and equity in learning. To decide how our grading practices should look, we need to ask why we're doing it, why we're changing it, what's the purpose, before we craft how those practices should look. Students can learn without grades. Teachers can teach without grades. So why are we doing it? Why are we grading? And I've just suggested that if we put grades on all of the assignments, it's less likely that students will engage and improve. So why are we grading at all? Well, historically, it's been to be able to put something on a report card. It's been to have a tally and end the year with a fair judgment of how students performed in a way that we can justify. You'll see people arguing out there about we should grade, we shouldn't grade. On Twitter, the TG2 chat, Teachers Going Gradeless chat, argue we shouldn't grade. And there are arguments that can be made from the literature on not grading or not grading so much or emphasizing feedback. But fundamentally, within a measurement perspective, this is a data reduction question. We're asking, how far should we reduce our data? So when you review a student's performance, or you review a paper, some work that a student turned in, you have a lot of thoughts about this work. You reduce that raw data, those raw data, to feedback that you give to a student. Maybe you have a conversation with a student, maybe you write comments on their paper, and so that's reduced from all of your thoughts to feedback. We reduce that feedback further when we assign a symbol to it or a mark to that individual piece of work. We reduce data further when we combine marks over time into a grade in that subject or on that standard in a report card. We reduce data further when we arrive at a GPA by collapsing grades across subjects and across standards. Most of the scholars in the area of classroom assessment would agree that arriving at a GPA means we've reduced too far. With each step in data reduction, you gain efficiency. It doesn't take as much time to review the data, but you lose information. And this doesn't mean we don't need to reduce our data at all. It just means we need to think about how far in reduction is too much. And if we look to the literature on the outcomes for students, on most of our classroom assessment work that we do, feedback is reducing it enough. It's only when we get to the end of reporting periods and the end of the year that we need to reduce it to be even more efficient. So how far should we reduce our data? This is a question for schools and teams to figure out. In traditional grading practices, we have reduced data to the subject level. So you can see in this report card on the right, we've reduced data to a grade in reading, in written communication, in mathematics, and so forth. But on the left, in a non-traditional report card, we've reduced data more specifically. We've reduced data to skills or standards within subject areas. And this allows us to give information that's more specific. It's not just how did you do in language arts, it's how did you carry out these particular skills within language arts, which helps inform our instruction, right? So you can't do much knowing that a student's struggling in language arts, but you can do a lot if you know exactly where the student is struggling in language arts. If the student is really struggling with identifying the main idea in a story, you have information to know what you need to do next. So in what way should we reduce our data? There are a number of ways that we reduce data, and one of the most common is to a percentage grade. Percentage grades, though, are based on percentage of items correct. It feels like it's more precise, it's more objective, but remember, we constructed the test the way that we thought it should be. We included the items that we thought should be included. We made them as difficult or as easy as we thought that they should be. So the whole test construction process is subjective. So just assigning percentage grades to that process does not make it inherently objective. Also, percentage of items correct is not the same as level of proficiency on skills. Any given assessment may measure multiple skills or multiple understandings, and so reducing our data by those skills or understandings or standards makes a lot more sense than simply calculating a percentage of items right. Percentage of items correct is not a proxy for learning. How many items a student got correct or incorrect is not as important as knowing what knowledge, skills, understandings, processes the student has gained. Averages and percentages do not give us meaningful information. Averaging is common practice in traditional grading, but let's take these three students to illustrate why this doesn't quite work. You've got three students here, Chris, Spencer, and Maisie. Chris kind of knew it coming in, and he gained some skills, and he was at that 4 level. He was at the highest level really early, so he was getting A's or 4s on his papers and on his work. Spencer did not know it at all coming into the class, but He gained the skill. He gained it in a predictable pattern in response to the teaching over time. Maisie really struggled to learn it. She didn't know it coming in, and it took her a long time. It took the teacher a long time to figure out how to get her there, but she got there. She got there in the end. They all got there, but if we average their grades in the end look like this. And this doesn't seem to be an accurate reflection of where the student is at the summative point in time. So if at the summative point in time we need to say where a student ended up, this is not an accurate reflection. To average across time is to say, I don't care if my teaching had any impact on student learning. That student who had to work really hard to get there deserves that grade, that 4, as much as the student who didn't have to work. And the teacher who had to work so hard to get that student there deserves that high grade as well. In a move to healthier grading practices, a 0 cannot be used as a proxy for missing data. Missing data or missing data. If I were to be conducting the census right now, and I'm going from house to house to find out who's in the household, what level of education do they have, how much money do they make. If I don't find out how much money the family makes, I can't just record a 0. That would distort the data completely. I don't have data to indicate that the family makes no money. I have no data. I have missing data. And the same happens when a student fails to turn in something. We do need to address that if a student is failing to submit work. But this is not an academic achievement issue necessarily. It may be that the student struggled to have time, struggled to have support, struggled to understand the assignment. We don't have evidence that the student doesn't know it. We have no evidence. So the answer is to get the evidence, not to record a 0 as a proxy for the missing data. It's fine though if you need to, in your grading program, record something that sets up a red flag that this is missing. That's fine if we do that. We just don't want to use something that's on our scale, on our usual grading scale, that means no progress or area of concern. We don't want to put that there because we don't have the evidence. We are missing the evidence. One of the first steps in making a move to healthier assessment and grading practices is separating academic learning from social emotional learning. Separating an understanding of what the student knows and understands and is able to do in social studies from their approaches to learning, from their habits, from their behaviors, from their punctuality and homework and responsibility and so forth. Those are separate. We need to understand when a student is having difficulty with the concepts of social studies versus they're needing some support, perhaps in self-regulation, perhaps in the ability to organize tasks and time and space, perhaps in motivation. When we separate these from one another, we have better information to know what to do. I'm going to do something very differently for a student who doesn't understand the concept from a student who is having difficulty being motivated to engage in the content. The strategies I'm going to use to support those two students are different. And so for that reason, if the primary purpose of my classroom assessment data are to inform my instruction, then I need to keep performance in those areas separate from one another. So this idea of keeping them separate is simply a data aggregation and display issue, or disaggregation and display issue. We're keeping our data disaggregated. So instead of combining, I know often in colleges we see 10% of your grade is participation, and that maybe that happens in schools sometimes still too. But it's not a matter of not measuring both of those, participation or engagement maybe is better. Measuring engagement and performance in the subject. It's still important that we measure and give feedback and work on both of those. It's just about the way we display our data. We're just not combining it. So it's not really harder. It's just, in fact, it can be easier not to try to aggregate your data and come up with complicated formula to do so. We just keep those data separate. We keep that information disaggregated so we can do something with it. The more important a skill is, the more important it is to keep it disaggregated. So if you say engagement is really important, then all the more reason to keep it disaggregated so it's clear. So it's clear to you, so it's clear to the students, so it's clear to families when they see grades and report cards exactly what it is that a student needs to work on. So the question you're left with is, what is the best way to disaggregate our data? What should be the standards or the categories of standards that appear on our report card and on classroom assessments when we grade them? And what should be the categories of processes, of social emotional learning, of behaviors that we also want to include? Deciding the best way to disaggregate our data is a question for schools and teams. So what should we think about, though, when we finally do get to the point of determining our scale? What makes a standards-based scale or a competency-based scale or a proficiency-based scale better than a traditional scale, and what's important to keep in mind for that? Here are 2 examples of scales. Neither of them, would I say, are what you should use. These are just 2 examples. The one on the right being more traditional. So this looks like a familiar, probably similar to what you had in graduate school. Graduate schools normally get rid of the D because the D is really a gentleman's F anyway. In the graduate schools where I've worked, the last letter is an E because it's the next letter. None of the other letters stand for something, but for whatever reason in a lot of schools we've made the F there so it stands for failure. But nonetheless, attaching this to the percentage of items correct is a traditional way of doing things. The one on the left is a standards-based scale. So it's a non-traditional scale for measuring progress. Now, a lot of people will argue for the one on the right, saying it's more specific, it's more precise, but it's really smoke and mirrors. If you give a student's paper to a teacher and explain how you graded it and cover up the way you graded it, the likelihood of their arriving at the exact same score is pretty low. So we don't really have 101 divisions of performance. It's really smoke and mirrors. And there aren't 101 different things we're going to do. So we don't really need that many categories. So, the argument of specificity really isn't even relevant when we're trying to make decisions about what we do with students and describe how they're performing. So what is it that makes this one standards-based? What's important to keep in mind? Well, first, there are multiple categories of performance in order. So the top one is the best performance, the bottom one is the lowest performance. You need enough categories to make the distinctions you need to make. You probably don't need 12 categories, and you probably wouldn't be able to get reliable on 12 categories. It would be difficult to get multiple teachers to agree to the same level for the same performance if you had that many categories. But you do need enough to make distinctions that you want to make. You need to know the difference between early progress, sort of beginning, they're well on their way, and they've gotten there. So you want enough distinctions to make, enough categories to make the distinctions you need to make. There's not a right number, though. It's not like 3 is the right number. Probably most schools have landed on 4 categories, some on 5. Much beyond 5, and I don't know that it's necessarily serving a purpose and may make reliability more difficult. The more categories you have, the more difficult reliability is. Now, reliability is a necessary condition for validity. You have to be able to have multiple teachers look at the same performance or work and agree on what level it is, independently, without discussing it with one another. Without that, you don't have a reliable measure. And if you don't have a reliable measure, you don't have a valid one. It's invalid if it's not reliable. So there's good reason not to have too many categories. And also, you really only want to have as many categories as you need to be able to serve the purpose of informing your instruction. The symbol doesn't matter. You can have numbers, you could have letters, you could have non-traditional letters, you could have stars, moons, and peace signs. I don't recommend this one, but the symbol doesn't matter. They all function in the same way. Now, some schools have gotten away from using letters and are instead using numbers to send the message that we're not doing it the old way. My only caution with that is you don't want to be tempted to do something with those numbers. You don't want to be tempted to calculate them in some way. So if you're using something other than non-traditional letters, we want to think about what we do with that. We have to have qualitative descriptors relative to a standard. So it can't just be 1, 2, 3. We have to say what those mean, because all we're doing is reducing our data from words to a symbol to make it take up less space. That's essentially what we're doing, and make it more efficient to consume. But those words have power. We have to be careful in the words that we choose. Just making a move to standards-based language doesn't necessarily make it more useful. So when we think about these words, a lot of times schools have made the decision to say no progress, progressing, and proficient, especially in early childhood. But we have to think about what that means. I mean, almost nobody's making no progress, and almost nobody's completely proficient until the end, so you end up with a scale that really looks like this, where almost no one is getting 3s, almost no one is getting 1s, and you just see 2s, 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 2s for everybody. Well, that doesn't really do a good job of informing you on what you need to do. It doesn't do a good job of informing parents or students of where they are. There's just this vast area of progressing. So we want to think about the words that we use. This word, exceeding expectations, is also problematic because it's often not defined. Teachers have a difficulty knowing what exceeds means, how it looks, and often have difficulty coming to agreement on this, which means there becomes difficulty with reliability. In upper grades, exceeds for many schools becomes the extra. It's on top of what we're going for. We're really going for proficient, which is the 3, but exceeds is the 4, so that we can acknowledge those superstars that have done the best. But that's not really what standards-based grading is about. It's not about distinguishing students from one another. It's about showing where they are toward the expectation. In upper school, not using this and making your top number or top symbol what you're going for with everyone will prevent a whole lot of phone calls, because when you're giving a lot of students 3s, but the 4 is there, parents are going to expect that their students are at the 4, and they're going to want to know why. Students and parents are going to be calling you saying, why didn't my child get a 4? How did they get a 4? And a fuzzy answer of, it's going over and beyond. We're not going to tell you how that looks, but just surprise me with something fantastic is just not going to satisfy parents and students, and it shouldn't. When we do make a move and we create these categories, we have to calibrate as teams, and not just once when we're creating our scales. We have to do this throughout the year to make sure that we're not having what we call in survey research coder drift. We have to make sure we stay on the same page. So we bring together examples of student work, we get around a table, we look at that work, and we come to consensus on what we mean by a 4, what we mean by a 3, or our qualitative descriptors for these pieces of work, to make sure that we're staying on the same page. When there's disagreement, we document the disagreement, come to consensus, and then document what it is that helped us come to this consensus so that we can stay there. In the end, really, I like to give an analogy of a GPS to standards, feedback, and grading. A GPS tells you where you're going. It keeps up with, your destination that you've put in. It tells you where you are right now, and it tells you how to get there. It gives you turn-by-turn directions to get you there. The whole purpose of the GPS is to not quite mentor you, but it's to get you there. The destination is where you're going. In our move to healthier grading practices, assessment practices, the destination is the standard. It's the expectation. It's where we're going. The current location is where a student is right now. The GPS does not average where you've been the past 2 hours. It tells you where you are right now. And that's really all a mark can do over time, is tell you where a student is right now. And at the end of the grading period, a grade tells you where the student ended up. And that's really all a grade can do. That's all that symbol can do, is tell you where you are. And so it better do that really, really well. The turn-by-turn directions are the feedback and support that we give students. This is the most important part of the entire assessment and grading system that we put into place. The feedback and support that we give to help a student get there, just like in a GPS. This is the most important component. It is necessary that we get the grading and the marking piece right, but it is not the piece that helps students learn. Grading and assessment in classrooms is a much bigger topic than what we've been able to cover in this video, but I hope this introduction to the broad components of moving away from traditional grading practices have been helpful. You can visit us online at www.leadinclusion.org to learn more about the work that we're doing.